I've been doing this job for 11 years, and the thing nobody tells you when you start is that the hardest part isn't the bad calls. It's the mundane ones. A woman who locked her keys in her car. A teenager who thought he was having a heart attack because he ate too many edibles. A man who called because his neighbor's sprinkler was hitting his fence and he wanted it on record. You take 100 of those in a row, and your brain starts to go soft at the edges. You stop listening as hard. You fill in the words before the caller says them. That's the thing I keep coming back to, whether I missed something early because I'd trained myself to stop paying attention. My name doesn't matter for this. What matters is that I work dispatch for a mid-sized county in the Pacific Northwest. Not a major metro. We cover maybe 80,000 residents, spread across a city center, and a lot of rural gaps where the cell service cuts out and people are still on landlines. We're a consolidated center, which means we handle police, fire, and EMS in the same room. 22 consoles, though on a typical overnight we're running with maybe 8 staffed. The room smells like old carpet and the particular burnt plastic smell of electronics that have been on continuously for 15 years. There's a motivational poster near the break room door that someone put up in 2009 and nobody has ever taken down. It says, "Every second counts" above a photo of a sunrise. The sunrise looks fake. I work the overnight rotation, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 4 days on, 4 days off. I chose nights originally because the differential pay made a meaningful difference when my daughter was young, and my ex-wife and I were doing the careful math of 2 people trying not to financially collapse after a divorce. Mia is 17 now. The differential stopped mattering a long time ago, but nights became home in a way days never were. There's a specific quality to the overnight that suits something in my temperament. The calls are fewer, but they carry more weight. You're not triaging parking complaints. If someone calls at 3 in the morning, something is actually happening. I've been on overnights long enough that I know most of the regulars. Every dispatch center has them, the frequent callers, the lonely ones, the genuinely unwell ones who cycle in and out of crisis. We're not supposed to develop opinions about them, officially. Unofficially, everyone does. You learn their voices before you learn their names. There's a woman in the north part of the county who calls every few months because she believes her neighbor is using a drone to monitor her property. There's an older man who calls whenever there's thunder because the thunder reminds him of something he won't say directly. You handle them with the same protocol every time. You send someone if there's any arguable reason. You document it. What happened to me started, I think, as precisely as I can trace it on a Tuesday in February. Not this past February, the one before. I've been sitting on this for over a year, partly because I wasn't sure how to explain it, and partly because I wasn't sure anyone needed to hear it. I'm still not sure. But I've been waking up at the same time most mornings, 4:47, which I'll explain later. And I think I need to put it somewhere outside my own head. The call came in at 2:18 a.m. I know the time exactly, because the CAD system timestamps everything to the second, and I've looked at that record more times than is probably healthy. The number that populated on my screen was local, a 360 area code. Nothing unusual there. What was unusual was the address. I need to explain how addresses work in our system. When a call comes in from a landline, the address associated with that number auto-populates in the CAD interface. It's pulled from the telecom database, which is linked to the 911 network. It's not infallible numbers get ported. People move and don't update their service, but it's accurate often enough that it's the first thing you look at. You're supposed to verbally confirm the address with the caller. That's protocol. But your eyes are already on it before they say a word. The address that came up was mine. My home address. The house I've lived in for 6 years, since I moved out of the apartment I had after the divorce and finally put down enough for a small place on the east side, with a yard that Mia could use when she came for weekends. I sat there for what was probably less than 2 seconds, but felt much longer. The cursor was blinking. I answered. 911. What's your emergency? Static. Not the dead kind, the kind with texture, like wind across an open microphone, or the sound of a room that hasn't been disturbed in a long time. Hello? I said. I can hear you on the line. Can you tell me where you are? Nothing. Then the call disconnected. The protocol for a disconnected call is clear. You attempt a callback. If you can't reach the caller and the address is populated, you send a welfare check. I followed the protocol exactly. I attempted a callback. The number rang 4 times and went to a generic voicemail message, not a personal greeting, just the automated carrier one. I entered the call in the system, sent a unit for a welfare check, and made a note in the comments field. Open line, no voice contact, possible accidental dial. I want to be precise about my mental state at that moment. I was not panicked. I was not even particularly unsettled. Not yet. I was aware that the address was mine. I was also aware, with the practiced compartmentalizing you develop in this job, that there was a rational explanation available. Numbers get associated with wrong addresses in the database all the time. A previous residence number, ported incorrectly. A data entry error somewhere upstream in the telecom chain. These things happen. I'd seen it before. What I hadn't done, and what I should have done immediately, was check whether the number itself matched anything I recognized. I didn't look at the full number. I don't know why. I looked at the address and I handled the call, and I moved on to the next thing in the queue, which was a minor traffic incident on Route 9 that needed a unit. The welfare check came back clear. Officers knocked, walked the perimeter, found nothing. The log reads, no disturbance observed, no answer at door, address appears residential and unoccupied. That last part is correct. I live alone. Mia stays with me every other week, but this was one of her mother's weeks. Nobody should have been there. I drove home at 7:15 that morning with the sun coming up through the windshield of my truck. I remember the particular quality of the light. That flat February light that's bright but completely without warmth, like someone aimed a fluorescent tube at the world. I let myself in through the back door, which is the door I always use because it's closer to the carport. The house was exactly as I'd left it. Coffee maker on the counter. Stack of mail I hadn't opened. Mia's rain jacket hanging on the hook by the door, even though she wasn't there, because she'd left it the last time, and I kept forgetting to remind her to take it. Nothing wrong. Nothing out of place. I told myself I'd look into the number when I got back in that evening. I showered, slept, ate, forgot to look into the number. The second call came exactly 1 week later. Same time, 2:18 a.m. Same number, same auto-populated address on my screen. This time, I recognized the number before I answered because our system flags repeat callers. The notation said prior contact, February 11th, open line, NVC. No voice contact. I answered anyway. 911. What's your emergency? Same static, same textured quiet. But this time, before the line went dead, I heard something that I've spent a long time trying to accurately categorize. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't breathing exactly. It was more like the acoustic quality of a space, the way a room sounds when someone is standing still in it, if that makes sense. The specific density of silence that isn't actually silence. You hear it sometimes on calls that come in from inside a structure, when the person has gone quiet because they're afraid to speak. There's a difference between an empty room and a room with someone in it, and you learn that difference after enough calls. I called back again. Same 4 rings, same generic voicemail. I sent another welfare check. The officers knocked for longer this time because they'd been to the address before. Still nothing. The log note this time: second check at this address within 7 days. No disturbance. No occupant observed. One of the officers, Davies, who I've worked with for years, came on the radio after clearing the call. He said, "Hey, you know this is your address, right?" I said I did. He paused a moment. "You want me to do a walk around inside? You can authorize it." I thought about it. "No," I said. "I'll be there in 5 hours. If anything was actually wrong, it would have been obvious." "Copy that," Davies said. And the way he said it wasn't judgmental, but it also wasn't quite neutral. I looked at the number when I got home that morning. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and pulled it up on my phone and ran it through a reverse lookup. It came back to my address. It came back to my name. I want to be very clear about what that means, because it's the detail that took me the longest to process. The number wasn't a previous resident's number associated with my address incorrectly. The number wasn't ported from somewhere else. According to the lookup database, that number was registered to me, to my name, at my address. I don't have a landline. I have a cell phone. One cell phone. I've never had a landline at this house, and I've been here 6 years. The house had a landline when I bought it. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Ruth who moved to assisted living, had the same number for decades. But I had it disconnected during the closing process because I had no use for it. I sat with that for a while. Then I did what I should have done earlier and called the telecom provider that serves our county's 911 infrastructure. I explained that I worked dispatch and that a number had been populating with my address incorrectly, and I asked them to check the MSAG, the Master Street Address Guide, that our 911 system pulls from. The woman I spoke to was efficient and not particularly interested in my problem. She told me she'd submit a correction request and that it could take up to 14 business days to propagate. I thanked her and hung up. I wasn't scared. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something closer to the specific irritation of a professional encountering an administrative problem in their own domain. A technical error that had made me send 2 welfare checks to my own house at 2 in the morning. That was annoying. It was also a little embarrassing, in the way that only other people in your field would really understand. I made a note in my personal log. I keep one. Just a small notebook where I write down anything work-adjacent that I want to remember. And I wrote, MSAG error, 360-XXX-XXXX populating as my address. Correction submitted. Monitor. I wrote the date. I drew a small box next to it, the kind you draw when you intend to check something off. Then I went to bed. Slept fine. Did not think about it again until the following Tuesday, when the call came in again at 2:18 in the morning, and this time I heard, very briefly, just before the line went dead, what I am still confident was a door. The sound of a door, somewhere in the house, quietly closing. I want to be careful about the word confident, because I've used it twice now, and I mean it differently each time. The first time confident, there was a rational explanation. That was the confidence of a person who hadn't looked closely yet. The second time is different. I've worked this job long enough that I know what I hear. I know the difference between line artifact and environmental sound. I know what a door sounds like. The soft mechanical compression of a latch. The small shift in room acoustics that follows. I heard it. Half a second. Maybe less. And then the line dropped. I sat with my headset on, and my hands on the desk, and I did not move for a moment. Then I called back. 4 rings. Generic voicemail. I didn't send a welfare check this time. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was professional. 2 checks in 2 weeks to my own address was already logged. Already something that a supervisor could notice if they were looking at the unit deployment patterns. But part of it was something else. something I'm less comfortable naming. I think I didn't want Davies or anyone else going into my house again. I'm not sure if that was embarrassment or something more protective, something that felt, in a way, I didn't examine closely, like it was mine to deal with. I called Mia instead. She was at her mother's. I knew that. I called anyway, and it rang through to voicemail, which it would because it was 2:19 in the morning and she was 17 and asleep. I didn't leave a message. I just needed to hear the outgoing recording, her voice, something grounding and ordinary. The rest of the shift I handled mechanically. A domestic disturbance on the south end. A medical call, elderly male, chest pressure, turned out to be anxiety. A noise complaint near the college. By 5 a.m., the room had that particular exhausted stillness it gets in the last stretch of an overnight. The dispatchers who are talking quietly, and the ones who aren't are staring at screens with the specific blank focus of people who are present, but not quite here. I drove home fast, not recklessly, but with intention. It was still dark, that blue-gray hour before the sky makes up its mind. I went through the front door instead of the back. I don't know why I made that choice. Maybe I wanted to see the whole entryway, rather than coming in from the carport side, where the sight lines are limited. The front door opens into a short hallway with the living room to the left and the stairs straight ahead. Everything looked the same. I walked through every room. I did it like I was looking for something specific, checking behind doors and inside the closets and even, and I'm aware of how this sounds, under the bed in the guest room where Mia sleeps when she's here. Nothing. The house was exactly as I left it, except that the kitchen window was slightly ajar, which I initially noted, and then immediately decided I had left open myself because the heater in the kitchen runs hot, and I do sometimes crack that window. I stood in the kitchen for a while. I made coffee. I looked at the window. I have a very specific memory of closing that window, standing at the sink, reaching up, pulling the latch down. I do it every time I leave for a shift because I have a mild, long-standing anxiety about leaving windows open when I'm gone. Probably traces back to something my father said once about drafts and utility bills, the kind of parental instruction that lodges in you below the level of reason. I close the kitchen window before I leave. I always close it. I could not prove that I had closed it that particular evening. I closed it now, latched it, and went to bed. Here is where I need to explain something about the way my mind works, because it's relevant to the decisions I made and didn't make over the next several weeks. I am not a person who readily accepts that something inexplicable is happening. That's not a personality flaw, or at least I've never thought of it that way. It's a professional orientation. In dispatch, you are constantly receiving incomplete information, and you have to build the most accurate picture possible from what you have, without overcorrecting in either direction. You don't want to undersell a situation and fail to send resources. You don't want to oversell it and clog the system with units responding to a non-emergency. You develop a calibrated skepticism. You hold the available evidence at arm's length, and you ask, what is the most probable explanation? The most probable explanation, assembled from what I had, was still mundane. A telecom error that the correction request hadn't resolved yet. An open line from somewhere, attached to the wrong address in the database. The door sound was an artifact, or I'd imagined it. Or it was something in the ambient noise of the call center itself. Sound travels strangely in that room at 3 in the morning. The window I'd left open myself and misremembered. I kept that framework intact for the next 2 weeks. The calls didn't come. I almost forgot about them. Then, on a Thursday, not a Tuesday, which mattered to me because I'd half-consciously started treating Tuesdays as the risk window. The call came in at 2:18 a.m. Same number, my address. I answered. This time there was no static buildup, no gradual settling. It was immediate. Room sound, close and clear. And within that sound, something I'd been trying to convince myself I hadn't heard on previous calls. Breathing. Slow, unlabored, like someone sitting still. I did not say anything for several seconds, long enough that protocol required me to speak, so I did. 911, I can hear you breathing. Can you tell me if you're okay? The breathing didn't change, didn't quicken, didn't stop. It just continued, patient and even, and then the call ended. I sat at my console and I wrote down in my personal notebook that I keep in my bag exactly what I heard and when. I'd started bringing the notebook to work by that point. I noted the time, the duration 41 seconds, and a description of the sound. I wrote deliberate in the margin and then crossed it out because it sounded like the kind of word I was using to make something normal into something frightening. Then I looked at what I'd written and thought about the fact that breathing is always deliberate. You don't breathe by accident. That's not what the word means. I sent a welfare check this time. I couldn't not send one, not after voice-adjacent contact. Davies was off. The unit that responded was a deputy I'll call Reyes, who I don't know as well, a younger guy, conscientious. He called in a check of the exterior, then asked for permission to attempt entry, since there'd been previous welfare checks at this address. I told him there was a key lockbox on the carport wall. I have one for Mia, so she can get in when I'm on shift, and I gave him the combination over the radio, which I felt a very specific kind of discomfort doing, like I was opening something I wouldn't be able to close again. He went inside. He was in there for about 4 minutes, which is longer than a standard walkthrough. When he came back on the radio, his voice was the particular flat, professional tone that deputies use when they're telling you nothing is wrong, but something felt off. No occupant, no signs of disturbance. Back bedroom window is open. I said, "Which back bedroom?" "Looks like a guest room. Windows up maybe 4 inches. No screen. You want me to close it?" The kitchen window was on the front corner of the house. The guest room was at the back. 2 different windows. I said yes, close it, and thank you. I marked the call and sat with what I knew, which was this. The kitchen window, front of house. The guest room window, back of house. I'd found the kitchen window open after the 3rd call. Reyes had found the guest room window open after the 4th. Different windows, same pattern. Open when they shouldn't be. I thought about the screen. He'd said no screen. Mia's window has a screen. I put them in myself 2 summers ago because she complained about mosquitoes. I did the guest room first because that's where she sleeps. And I remember it clearly because the frame was slightly warped, and it took me 20 minutes to get the screen seated right. There was a screen on that window. There was a screen on that window when I installed it, and nothing that I knew of had happened to remove it. I didn't say any of that to Reyes. I logged the call and went back to work. After the shift, I stopped at a hardware store before going home and bought 2 window alarms, the kind that are essentially a pair of magnets, one on the sill and one on the frame, that trigger if the circuit breaks. $12 each. I installed them on the kitchen window and the guest room window. Then I walked through the rest of the house and checked every window and every exterior door. Everything was latched. The screen on the guest room window was there, seated in the frame, slightly loose at the lower right corner, where the warp in the frame had always made it imperfect. There was no damage to it, no cuts, no bending, just the looseness that had always been there. I looked at it for a long time. Then I pushed it firmly into the frame and went to make coffee. Mia was due to come for her week on Friday. I almost called her mother to change the arrangement. I want to be honest about that. I thought about it seriously, standing in the kitchen with my phone in my hand. I told myself I wasn't going to upend Mia's schedule over a telecom glitch and 2 open windows. That's what I told myself. What was actually happening, I think, was that I didn't want to explain why I wanted to change the arrangement. Explaining it meant assembling it in words, and assembling it in words meant it became something. It was easier to keep it as a loose collection of incidents that hadn't quite added up yet. Mia came Friday. She was in the particular mood that 17 can produce, not unkind, just interior, occupied with things I wasn't part of. She spent most of the weekend in her room doing homework, or whatever else she does in there, and the house felt normal in the way it only does when she's in it. I slept during the day when she was at school, and worked my shifts, and when I was home, I checked the windows every time I came in. The alarms didn't trigger. The following Tuesday night, she was asleep upstairs when the call came in. I'd thought about this. In the 2 days before, I'd thought about what I would do if the call came while she was there. I hadn't come to a good answer. What I knew was that I couldn't send a welfare check to my own house while my daughter was sleeping in it. The deputies would knock. She'd wake up confused and frightened. She'd call me, and I'd have to explain from a dispatch console why I'd sent police to the house. What I also knew was that if something was actually wrong, if someone was in that house, I couldn't not send someone. I answered at 2:18. 45 seconds of that room sound, the quality of occupied air. No breathing this time. Something else. Quieter. I've tried to describe it to myself in a lot of different ways. The closest I can get is movement that isn't footsteps. Weight redistributing. Someone shifting in a seated position, maybe. Or leaning. The smallest possible physical communication that a body exists in a space. I texted Mia. I know it was 2:19 in the morning. I texted her anyway. Hey, sorry to wake you. Can you just text back so I know you're up? 40 seconds. Then, Dad, what the hell? Sorry. Go back to sleep. She was awake. She was fine. The sound on the line, whatever it was not my daughter. I knew it wasn't my daughter before I texted, but I needed to be sure in a way that went past knowing. The call dropped at 2:19:03. I called back. This time, for the first time, it didn't ring through to voicemail. It rang once, and there was a sound, a brief sound, like someone picking up a receiver and immediately setting it back down, and then silence, and then the automated message. Someone had answered and hung up. I spent the rest of the shift trying to figure out where that number had actually come from. Not the database entry, which I'd already reported. The physical origin. A number exists because a service provider created it and assigned it. I submitted a formal inquiry through our system's technical support channel, the one we use for legitimate database corrections and telecom issues. I explained that a number had been populating with a residential address incorrectly, and that the previous correction request didn't appear to have resolved it. I asked for a trace on the number's current service status, what provider was currently holding it, whether it was attached to active service. The response came back 2 days later. I read it 3 times. The number had been inactive since 2019. It was associated with a residential landline that had been disconnected at the time of a property transaction. The property address on the account matched my address. The account holder's name was Ruth. Ruth was the woman I'd bought the house from. 83 years old, moved to assisted living, disconnected her landline during closing. That's what I'd assumed earlier, and the documentation confirmed it. Her number, disconnected in 2019, should not have been capable of generating any outbound calls. According to the telecom provider, the number was not in active service. It was not assigned to any current account. It was, in the technical language of the response email, retired and unallocated. You cannot call from a number that doesn't exist. I read that phrase, retired and unallocated, and I sat with it, and I thought about the specific texture of the quiet on those calls, and the way the call had been answered on the last attempt. Receiver lifted and set down, deliberate and unhurried. The word I'd crossed out in my notebook was still there, underneath the strike-through. Still legible. I forwarded the email to myself. Personal address, not work. I don't know if that violated any policy. Technically, the inquiry was submitted through official channels, so the response was a work document. But I needed it somewhere I could access it at 3 in the morning from my kitchen table without logging into the CAD system. I needed to be able to read it again in plain light and confirm that it said what I thought it said. It kept saying the same thing. I started doing something I'm not proud of. Professionally, I started pulling the call records myself. Not just mine. I ran a search in the system for that number going back as far as the archive allowed, which in our county is 7 years. I did it during slow stretches of overnight shifts when the queue was thin, and my supervisor was in the back office doing scheduling. Technically, I had the access. Whether I had the legitimate reason is a different question. I told myself it was a database integrity issue, and that I was following up on my own correction request. That's the kind of thing you tell yourself. What I found was 12 prior calls from that number over the past 4 years. All before my tenure at this address. The earliest was 2021, which means they started about 2 years after Ruth's number was supposedly disconnected. All of them overnight. All of them between 2 and 3 in the morning. All of them logged as open line, no voice contact. Welfare checks dispatched to my address. Every check had come back clear. 12 calls over 4 years, and then a gap of about 8 months, and then mine started. I cross-referenced the assigned units on those older checks. Different deputies, different shifts. No single officer had responded to enough of them to notice a pattern. The calls were spread thin enough across different names that nobody would have flagged them. If you pulled any one of them in isolation, it looked like a routine misdial or a database error. You'd have to look at all 12 together, laid out to see that they were anything other than random noise. Nobody had done that. Nobody would have reason to. I only did it because it was my house. I sat with those records for a while. 12 calls from a dead number, landing at a consistent hour. Over 4 years, all resolved without incident. A pattern of contact that predated me by 2 years and had apparently paused, or I was going to say stopped. But that word felt wrong for 8 months before resuming when I moved in, or when I started working nights, or for some other reason I didn't have yet. I wrote the dates and times in my notebook, laid them out in 2 columns. The prior 12, then mine, now 5. I stared at the arrangement. No specific interval between the older calls. Nothing that would give you a cycle or a sequence. But the time was consistent. Not 2:17, not 2:20. Always 2:18. Which sounds like a coincidence, except that in 4 years and 17 calls, it had never been anything else. 2:18 is not an accident. 2:18 is a habit. Or something close enough to a habit that the distinction stopped comforting me. I looked up Ruth. I want to be clear that I had very little to go on, and that what I was doing started to feel, even to me, like the kind of thing a person does when they've decided something is true, and they're building backward toward evidence. I was aware of that risk. I tried to stay with the concrete. Name, former address, moved to assisted living 2019. That's what I knew from the closing documents. The assisted living facility was in the same county, about 12 miles north. I found it without much effort. I found, also without much effort, and with more discomfort, an obituary. Ruth had died in March of 2022. She was 87. The obituary was brief, no immediate family listed. A few words about her years as a school librarian. A request that memorials be directed to the County Literacy Council. The photo was small and grainy, the kind that gets scanned from a physical print. An older woman with neat white hair and the particular composed expression of someone who spent their life in rooms where you were expected to be quiet. She died in March 2022. The calls from her number started in the fall of 2021. I'm not going to say what I thought when I read that. I'm going to say that I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a grocery store where I'd pulled over to look at my phone, and I watched a woman push a cart back to the cart return, and I thought about the 8 months of silence before my call started, and I thought about Ruth's hands on the windows of that house for however many years she'd lived there, and I thought about the particular patience of someone who has been trying to reach a person who isn't there yet. I drove home. The next 3 shifts I worked without incident. No calls from the number. I started to wonder if the act of looking, of pulling those records, finding the obituary, assembling the history, had changed something. I was aware of how irrational that was. Evidence gathering doesn't alter the evidence. Understanding a pattern doesn't interrupt it. But there's a superstitious streak in most people who've worked overnight dispatch long enough, a belief that attention itself has weight, that some things prefer not to be looked at directly. I don't endorse the belief. I'm just telling you it crossed my mind. Then 2 things happened in the same week, and the framework I'd been maintaining, the careful, skeptical, professional framework, became very difficult to sustain. The first was a conversation with my supervisor, a woman named Carol, who's been running the overnight for 9 years, and who has the precise interpersonal style of someone who's good at her job and completely uninterested in anything outside it. She called me into the back office on a Wednesday morning near the end of shift and told me she'd noticed I'd been running historical call searches and asked what I was working on. I told her the database integrity issue, the number associated with my address, incorrectly. I said I was trying to trace it fully before submitting a complete correction. She looked at me for a moment in the way she looks at things. Not suspicious, exactly, just evaluating. Then she said, "I pulled those same records after the second welfare check to your address. Just wanted to make sure there wasn't a liability issue with units repeatedly responding to a dispatcher's home." I asked her what she'd found. "Same thing you found," she said. "Old number, prior contacts, no clear pattern." She paused. The timestamp bothered me. I said, "It bothered me too." She nodded once. I flagged it with our telecom coordinator. Asked them to look at the routing architecture for that number, whether something in the switch was generating phantom pings. I asked when that was. "About 3 weeks ago." She picked up a pen, not to write anything, just to have something in her hand. "They got back to me yesterday. There's no active routing path for that number. The switch that would have handled it was decommissioned in 2021. They don't know how the calls are generating." She said it the way you say something when you've spent time deciding not to make it bigger than it is. Flat. Professional. The voice of someone exercising discipline over their own reaction. "What do they recommend?" I said. "They don't. They said they'd keep monitoring." She set the pen down. "I'm just telling you because it's your address. If the calls continue, I want you to flag them to me directly so I can document them on our end. We may need to loop in the county IT office." That was it. She didn't speculate. She didn't ask me if I was sleeping okay or whether I needed to talk to someone. That's not Carol's way, and I didn't want it to be. What she gave me was professional acknowledgement, and at that point, it meant more than I would have expected. I wasn't alone in finding something wrong. The telecom coordinator, working from a completely different direction, had arrived at the same absence of explanation. The second thing happened at home, and this one I've been less sure how to write down. Mia had her school's winter formal that week. Her mother was handling most of it. The dress, the transportation, the before pictures that I was told would happen at her friend Gabby's house. I was on shift during the pictures, but I saw the photos her mother texted me afterward. Mia looked like someone I recognized, and someone I was still catching up to simultaneously. The way you feel when a child moves faster than your image of them. She came to stay with me for the following 3 days. Normal days. She made pasta one night because she's been interested in cooking lately, and I sat at the kitchen counter and talked to her about it the way you talk to someone when the conversation itself is the point and the pasta is just the occasion. She went to bed around 11 and I left for work at 10:45, which meant we said goodnight in the kitchen, and I told her to lock the back door, and she said she would, and she did, because I checked before I left. I was gone for 8 hours. When I came home at 7:30, Mia was awake and already showered and making coffee with the focused expression of a teenager who has not had enough sleep but is committed to having a normal morning. I came in the back door and she handed me a mug without preamble, which is one of my favorite things she does, and I sat down at the table. She said, after a minute, "Did you come home last night? Like, early?" I said no. My shift was until 7. She knew that. She looked at her coffee. I heard someone in the house, around 2-something, like downstairs, moving around. I asked her what kind of moving around. She thought about it with the specificity that I recognize as her method. She doesn't catastrophize. She inventories. Not like someone looking for stuff. Just walking, maybe. Slow. Like someone who knew where they were going. I asked if she'd been scared. I was going to come down, but then it stopped. She shrugged. One shoulder. The way she does when she's minimizing something she isn't sure deserves a bigger reaction. I figured it was you. Coming home early or something. I set my mug down. I thought about what I was going to say, and what I was not going to say, and I made a choice in that moment that I've questioned since. I said, probably the house settling, old place. She accepted that with the undemanding trust that cuts through me sometimes. That particular form of it, where she doesn't press, because she's not worried, and she's not worried because she trusts that I would tell her if she should be. And I was sitting across from her having made the decision not to tell her. After she left for school, I went through the house again. Every room, every window, checking the alarms, all intact, all latched. Nothing open, nothing moved. I checked the front door, which I hadn't used, still locked from inside. I sat on the couch for a long time. The house was quiet in its ordinary way. Radiator ticking. The muffled sound of traffic from the main road a block over. Normal sounds I'd cataloged years ago and stopped hearing. But I was hearing them now. Because what Mia had described, the specific quality of movement she'd described, slow and directional and purposeful, matched something I'd been avoiding naming. The sound on the calls, weight redistributing, someone who knew where they were going. She'd heard it at 2 in the morning. The calls came at 2:18. There had been no call that night. No call logged in the system. No number populating on my screen. Whatever Mia heard moved through my house at that hour without calling first. That was new. That was different in a way that I couldn't fit into the pattern I'd been tracking, which meant either the pattern was wrong or the pattern had expanded into something the calls were only one part of. I thought about all the welfare checks that had come back clear. Deputies walking through, finding nothing. Reyes saying the guest room window was open. The screen I'd installed, still seated in its frame. No signs of entry. No mechanism available for entry, given the alarms were untriggered. 12 calls over 4 years, and every check negative. And now my daughter heard footsteps while I was at work, and I had told her it was the house settling. I'd left out something. I've been leaving it out, and I'm only now able to write it. The obituary. Cause of death wasn't listed, which is common. But I'd done more than just read the obituary. I'd looked further. I don't know what I was looking for exactly, or I knew and didn't want to say. And I'd found the facility's public disclosure records, which they're required to file with the county health office. Ruth had died in her room at the facility. It was March, a Tuesday, early in the morning. The records didn't give an exact time. But I thought about it now, sitting in my house in the particular quiet of a winter morning, and I thought about 2:18, and I thought about Tuesday, and I thought about the way she'd looked in that photograph, composed and quiet. Someone who'd spent their life in rooms that required silence. And I thought about the windows. Not breaking in, checking. I need to explain what a dispatcher does with a theory they can't report. There's no form for it. No protocol, no checkbox, no field in the CAD system where you enter. Caller may be deceased. Purpose of contact appears to be property welfare check. No threat to current occupant. Carol had been professional and careful, and she'd given me more than most supervisors would. But there was a hard limit to what I could bring to her. I could bring her a telecom anomaly. I could not bring her Ruth. So I did what I do with things I can't process at work. I broke it into its components, and I handled each one separately. Component 1 was Mia. I called her mother that afternoon, before Mia got back from school. I kept it vague, told her there'd been some activity on the block, possibly a prowler, and that I was going to have a security company come assess the house. Asked if Mia could stay there for a week or two while I got it sorted. Her mother is not someone I have an easy relationship with, but she's not unreasonable, and she didn't press for details. She said fine. I texted Mia separately and told her there was a plumbing situation that was going to require some disruptive work, and that she should plan to stay at her mom's for a bit. Mia sent back a thumbs up, and then, after a pause, a follow-up that said, "Are you okay?" I said I was fine. She said, "Okay." The exchange had the particular texture of a kid who doesn't quite believe you, but has decided to let you have it. That's the one I'm not over. That text exchange. Component 2 was the calls. I needed to understand the mechanism better than I did, and the telecom channel was exhausted. They had no routing path and no explanation. So I went to the other direction. Not the infrastructure, the house itself. I went to the county assessor's office on a Thursday, my day off. The assessor's records are public, and the clerk there is used to people coming in for property history. I asked for the complete transaction history on my address going back as far as available. She printed it out without comment. 12 pages. Ruth had lived in that house for 51 years. She bought it in 1968 with her husband, a man named Gerald, who died in 1991. After that, it was just Ruth. 51 years total at the address, 31 of them alone. The property passed to me through the estate when she went to assisted living. I don't know why the length of time affected me the way it did. 51 years in the same house, that's a depth of habitation I don't have a reference for. I've lived in 4 places as an adult, none of them for more than 8 years. But 51 years means that every room was known to her in a way rooms don't usually get known. The particular draft that comes through the kitchen in winter. The way the stairs sound underfoot in the 3rd step from the bottom, which has a specific creak I've lived with for 6 years and stopped noticing. The windows, which she would have opened and closed thousands of times. The specific resistance of each latch, the slight warp of the guest room frame. She knew all of it without thinking. The way you know your own body. I drove home from the assessor's office and I sat in the carport for a few minutes without getting out. It was late afternoon, the light already going gray. From where I was sitting, I could see the guest room window on the second floor, latched, the way I'd left it. I thought about what it would mean to really accept the thing I'd been assembling. Not as a theory, not as a set of correlating data points, but as something I was going to act on. A woman who lived in this house for 51 years had been calling it from a disconnected phone at 2:18 in the morning, consistently, for 4 years. The calls predated me. They'd been landing on whoever was here, and before me, no one was here. The house sat empty for 2 years during the estate process, which meant the calls were landing on an empty console. Welfare checks dispatched to an empty house. Nothing found, because nothing was wrong. She wasn't calling because something was wrong. Carol had said it. They don't know how the calls are generating. The telecom coordinator had no explanation. Ruth wasn't generating the calls. Ruth was answering them. Answering whatever pull toward the house still existed in whatever she'd become after 2022. And that pull was taking the shape of the most familiar action. She had a phone number she'd had for decades, a home she'd left and not been able to stop checking on. I'm aware of how that sounds. I've been aware the entire time. But I want you to understand that I'd spent 6 weeks eliminating other explanations, and I'd run out of them. And the one remaining was the one I'd been refusing to name. At some point, refusing to name a thing becomes its own kind of problem. You're spending energy on avoidance that you need for something else. I went inside. I didn't do anything dramatic. I didn't talk to the air or leave anything out or perform any gesture that would embarrass me to describe. I walked through the house the way I'd been walking through it for 6 years, touching the same surfaces, checking the same windows. Then I sat at the kitchen table with the assessor's printout, and I read it again. And I said out loud, in an ordinary voice, the way I'd say something to myself when I was alone. I'm not going to do anything to the house. You don't have to check it. The kitchen was quiet. The radiator made the sound it always makes. I felt, and I want to be precise about this because I know how it sounds. I felt the quality of the room change slightly. Not a sound, not a temperature drop. None of the theatrical signals. Just the specific texture of quiet that I'd been learning to recognize from 41-second open line calls at 2:18 in the morning. The quality of a space where someone is standing still and listening. Then it went back to being an empty kitchen, and I made dinner, and I went to work. The following Tuesday, the call came in at 2:18. I answered immediately. "I'm here," I said. Not the protocol greeting. Just that. The room sound. The occupied air. And then, for the first time in all of it, a voice. Not clear. Not a word I could transcribe exactly. But the shape of a voice. The specific frequency of someone older. A woman. And what the voice was doing was not speaking in sentences. It was doing what voices do when they're asking something very simple in a tone that doesn't require elaboration. A rising inflection. The sound of a question that contains its own answer. Still here? Or that's what I heard. I can't be certain. I've replayed the recording. I flagged the call and pulled the audio file afterward, which I'm technically allowed to do, and I've listened to it probably 30 times. There's a sound, a voice-shaped sound. The transcription system our county uses rendered it as unintelligible, which is accurate and completely insufficient. I said, "Yes, still here." The line held for another few seconds, and then, so quietly that I almost missed it under the static, got a second sound. Different texture from the first. Lower, younger, I've been trying not to say this part. I've been building toward it and pulling back for a year, and I think that's why I'm still waking up at 4:47, because the thing I haven't said keeps finding the seam in the night where it fits. The second sound was Mia's name. Not my name. Not a question. Just her name, said the way you say the name of someone you've been watching over, with the weight of someone who has been in the same rooms with her and knows her, who has heard her in the kitchen making pasta, who noticed the rain jacket on the hook by the door. The line dropped at 2:19:03. I logged the call. I put on my headset. I did my job for the next 4 hours and 47 minutes because there was nothing else I could do in a dispatch center at 2:30 in the morning. What I was thinking about, under all of it, was the jacket. Mia's rain jacket, on the hook by the back door. She'd left it last month, and I kept forgetting to send it back with her. It was there every time I came home. I'd stop seeing it the way you stop seeing familiar things. But Ruth would have seen it. If Ruth was moving through the house at 2:18 on the mornings I was working, checking the windows, checking the rooms, doing what she'd done for 51 years, she would have seen a teenager's rain jacket on a hook that had probably held Ruth's own jacket for decades. She would have understood what it meant, that there was a child in this house, that someone needed watching. 12 calls before mine, over 4 years, while the house sat empty. The calls landing on no one. Then me, and the calls continuing, and the windows open but never damaged, and the checks always clear. And Mia hearing slow footsteps at 2 in the morning from someone who knew where they were going. Not threat. Patrol. That was the word that came to me and wouldn't leave. The specific function of someone making rounds. Not haunting, not unfinished business, not the theatrical residue of trauma. Just the durable habit of someone who'd spent half a century making sure this house was okay. Death had interrupted it, and then apparently not interrupted it entirely. And for 4 years, the habit had continued into whatever medium was available, which was a disconnected phone number, and open windows, and a quality of air in the small hours that I'd learned to read the way I read open lines. She was making sure the house was okay. She was making sure we were okay. I drove home at 7:15 and sat in the carport again. This time I got out quickly. I went in the back door. The jacket was on its hook. I picked up my phone and called Mia. It was 7:20 in the morning and she was at her mother's, and she'd just gotten up. She answered with the specific verbal texture of someone who was awake, but not yet organized. "Dad, it's 7 in the morning. I know. I wanted to ask you something." "Okay." "That night you heard someone in the house. You said slow footsteps, like someone who knew where they were going." Silence for a moment. "Yeah." "Did you feel scared? In the moment?" "Not after." "In the moment." She thought about it. I could hear her thinking. "No," she said finally. "I mean, I was confused, but not really scared. I figured it was you." Another pause. "Why?" "I was just thinking about it," I said, "trying to make sure you felt okay about coming back." "Dad, it was probably the house settling." She said it back to me, my own explanation, and I almost said something. I had the shape of the whole thing in my mind. Ruth, the calls, the obituary, Mia's name on an open line, and for one moment I wanted to give it to her, set it down between us and let her look at it. I didn't. I'm still not sure if that was the right call. "Plumbing situation's resolved," I said. "You can come back whenever you want." "Okay, cool. Can we get that pasta again?" I said yes. She hung up. I stood in the kitchen with my phone in my hand, and the jacket on the hook, and the particular morning quiet of a house that has been alone all night and is now occupied. And then I opened my notebook, and I looked at everything I'd written over the past 6 weeks. The timestamps, the dates, the telecom records, the 12 prior calls, Ruth's death in March 2022, the windows, the screen, the word deliberate under the strike-through, and I turned to a clean page and wrote one line. She's watching the house. Then I wrote under it, I need to figure out how to tell her she can stop. The problem with that line, I need to figure out how to tell her she can stop, is that I wrote it like it was a task with a method, like there was a procedure I could locate and follow. I've been trained to think that way. Every situation has a protocol. You identify the need, you identify the appropriate response, you execute. The training is genuinely useful most of the time. It becomes a problem when you apply it to things that don't have protocols. I spent 2 weeks trying to construct one anyway. What I kept coming back to was this. Every contact had been initiated by her. The calls, the windows, the footsteps Mia heard. I'd spoken once into an empty kitchen and felt the quality of the room shift, but I had no way of knowing if that had landed, if language worked in whatever direction I was trying to send it. The one call where I'd broken protocol and said, "I'm here," instead of the standard greeting she'd spoken on that call, the only time, and said Mia's name. That suggested she could hear me, that the channel ran both ways. But what I said on that call was confirmation. Yes, still here. Which in retrospect was exactly the wrong thing to say to someone checking whether the house was occupied. I'd told her yes, there were people here, and she'd responded by naming the one she was most concerned about. I'd answered the welfare check instead of closing it. So that was the framing I eventually settled on. Not a ritual, not a gesture, not anything I'd be embarrassed to describe to Carol if Carol asked. A communication, dispatcher to caller, acknowledgement that the concern had been received and addressed, and that the situation was stable and no further response was required. The problem was the medium. I didn't know how to initiate. Every contact had come through the 911 line, which meant it came through her. She called. I answered. I couldn't call a disconnected number and expect anything other than the generic voicemail I'd been reaching for 6 weeks. I couldn't leave a message on a line that technically didn't exist. The channel only seemed to open from her side. I thought about that for a long time, about what the calls actually were. Not metaphorically, mechanically. A number that the telecom coordinator confirmed had no active routing path was somehow generating inbound calls to a county emergency system. The switch that would have handled it had been decommissioned in 2021, before the calls started. There was no infrastructure explanation, which meant the calls weren't traveling through the infrastructure. They were arriving in the system without traveling through anything that could be audited. They were just there, populated in the CAD, time-stamped, logged, audio on record. Real enough that Carol had noticed them, real enough that units had been dispatched 17 times. But originating from somewhere the telecom coordinator couldn't trace. If the origin was her, and I'd run out of other explanations, then the channel wasn't a phone line. The phone line was just the shape her reaching took, the most familiar form available. The instrument she'd used for 51 years to communicate across distance. I couldn't call her back on it. But there were other forms. I'm going to sound like a person who lost their professional footing here. I want to say, clearly, that I don't believe that's what happened. What I did next was not a break with reason. It was the application of the same logic I'd been using the entire time, following the available evidence toward the available action. If the medium was the house, and the communication was about the house, then the response needed to be in the house. I took a day when Mia wasn't there, a Thursday in April, my day off, good weather coming in from the west. I opened every window in the house, not randomly, deliberately, The way you open windows in spring to turn a house over. Let the stale air move out. I did the kitchen first, then the living room, then upstairs, the bathroom and the guest room, and my own room, every window that would open. The guest room frame still had its warp, and the screen still sat slightly loose at the lower right corner, and I left it exactly as it was. I didn't want to fix it anymore. Then I walked through the house slowly, not looking for anything, just moving through the rooms the way you move through a space you know well, touching the familiar surfaces. The banister, the kitchen counter, the hook by the back door where Mia's jacket had been rehung after she came back, along with a second jacket now, a heavier one she'd decided to keep here instead of hauling it back and forth. I sat at the kitchen table with the windows open and the spring air moving through, and I talked. Normally, the way I'd talk to myself when I was alone, which I've been doing my whole life and have never been embarrassed about until this moment of writing it down. I talked about the house, specific things, the creak in the third stair, which I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years and had come to appreciate as a feature you always knew when Mia was coming down. The kitchen window that runs hot, and why I crack it in winter. The guest room screen with its warped frame. I told her I'd installed those screens myself, both of them, summer before last. Took me most of a Saturday afternoon. I told her the house was in good shape, that I'd painted the back fence last fall, that the maple in the backyard had come through the winter without losing any major branches, which I'd been watching because one of them has a lean I don't love. I told her Mia made pasta now, that she was getting genuinely good at it. I said the house was okay, that we were okay. Then I said, because it was the thing I'd been building toward and I didn't know a way to arrive at it that wasn't direct. You can rest now. I've got it from here. The windows were open. The spring air came through. Nothing shifted. Nothing changed. The kitchen was just a kitchen. I sat there for a while longer, and then I got up and made lunch, and ate it standing at the counter, which is my habit, the way Ruth probably had her habits. And in the afternoon I fixed the creak in the third stair, which only took 20 minutes, and which I should have done 2 years ago. The following Tuesday I went to work and handled my shift, and at 2:18 in the morning I watched my screen. Nothing. I told myself one data point wasn't a pattern. 6 weeks of calls and one missed Tuesday meant nothing statistically. I logged the quiet the way I log everything in my notebook. A small notation, no interpretation. I went home, I slept, I came back Thursday, and the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. No calls. 3 weeks of clean Tuesday nights became 6, and 6 became the end of the month, and I started to ease up on watching the clock at 2:17. Started letting the shift be a shift again, taking calls from people who'd locked their keys in their cars, teenagers with anxiety attacks, noise complaints near the college. I want to be careful not to make that sound like resolution. It wasn't resolution. It was the absence of continuation, which is a different thing. I still checked the windows when I came home. Still felt the specific quality of the house when I walked in, occupied or unoccupied. The way you feel the state of a room before you've consciously assessed it. The house felt like a house. It had felt like something else for a while, something watched from the inside. And then it went back to feeling like 4 walls and a roof that belonged to me. Most nights. Most mornings. The thing I didn't expect was Mia noticing. She was staying for a long weekend in late May, school winding toward its end. The loose, easy rhythm that comes with the last weeks of a year. We were eating dinner the pasta, which she'd refined by this point, and was making with a confidence that I was careful not to overpraise because she'd find it embarrassing. And she said, without particular setup, "Did you ever figure out that plumbing thing?" I said it had worked itself out. She nodded, ate. Then, The house feels different. I looked at her. Different how? She thought about it in her inventory way. Less. I don't know. Less like someone's home when nobody's home. She said it without any awareness of what she was describing. The way you say a true thing that you haven't examined. It used to feel like that sometimes. Like I'd come back and it felt occupied even when you weren't here yet. Kind of like. She paused, looking for the word. Warm. Not temperature. Just like someone had been sitting in it. I said I knew what she meant. It doesn't do that anymore, she said. It's not bad, just different. She twirled pasta. Maybe I was just used to it. I said probably. We ate. She told me about something that had happened at school involving a group project and a person named Derek, who she described with the restrained contempt of someone who has been very patient for a very long time. I listened and made the appropriate sounds and thought about the word she'd used, warm, and thought about 51 years of someone sitting in these rooms, and then 31 more years alone in them, and then assisted living, and then March 2022, and then the calls, 4 years of calls landing on empty consoles in an empty house, and then me. I thought about what she would have found when she first started checking after she died. An empty house in the process of becoming someone else's. 2 years of estate proceedings, the slow administrative transfer of a life into property, and then me moving in, a man alone, working nights, and then gradually Mia's jacket on the hook, Mia's things appearing in the guest room, Mia's voice in the kitchen on the weekends, the house being used the way a house is supposed to be used, a person in it who locked the windows before he left, even if he sometimes misremembered, a girl who knew how to make pasta. Maybe that's what the watching was for. Not alarm, assessment. The 51-year habit of knowing this house's state, turning toward the question of whether the people now in it were going to be all right, whether they needed anything. I've tried not to make it sentimental. I've been trying this whole time to stay with what I actually know, what I can document, what the evidence supports. The calls are logged in the county system. The telecom coordinator's response is in my email. The 12 prior calls are in the archive. The audio file from the night I heard the voice has unintelligible in the transcript field and something voice-shaped in the waveform. These things are real, and they are documented, and they are not explained. What I've layered on top of them. Ruth. The checking. The warmth Mia described. That's inference. That's me doing the same thing I do every night at work. Building the most probable picture from incomplete information, and incomplete information only. I could be wrong. I've been wrong about calls before. You think you know what's happening on the other end of the line, and you get there, and the situation is completely different. But I don't think I'm wrong. I think a woman who lived in this house for 51 years kept checking it after she died, the way habits persist past their occasion, and I think she checked it until she had enough information to know it was okay, and then she stopped. I think she heard me say, "I've got it from here," and believed me, or decided to. I think she said Mia's name on an open line at 2:18 in the morning, because Mia was the thing she wanted confirmed. The rain jacket on the hook, the life in the house. And I think when she heard Mia's voice in the kitchen and heard me say we were okay, she put the phone down. I still wake up at 4:47 most mornings. Not every morning, but most. I don't know why it's that time specifically. I've looked at the call records again, and there's nothing significant at 4:47. No timestamp that matches. My body just finds it. I wake up and the room is dark, and I lie there for a minute or two, aware of the house around me, the specific arrangement of it, the third stair and the kitchen window, and the maple in the backyard, with its problematic branch. I think about whether the windows are latched. Usually I know without checking. Usually I can tell from the way the air sits. Mostly I go back to sleep. Sometimes I get up and walk through the rooms. Not because I heard something, not because anything is wrong, just because it's my house, and I know where everything is. And there's a version of that, of knowing exactly where you are in the dark, knowing the layout by feel, every surface familiar under your hand that isn't frightening at all. It just means you've been somewhere long enough. I think about that. I think about what long enough feels like from the other side of it, from 51 years in the same rooms. And I think that what I said to her in April was probably right. Probably the right thing and probably believed. I hope so. I want her to be somewhere that isn't an open line in the small hours, isn't the specific fatigue of a habit that won't release. I want whatever she became after March 2022 to have somewhere better to be than a house she already finished living in. The calls stopped. The windows stay latched. The house is warm, in the way Mia said, not temperature, just warm. And I think that's mine now. That's us, in the rooms, using them, filling them with the small, ordinary evidence of a life being lived, which is all anyone can really leave behind, and all anyone can really ask for. I locked the kitchen window before I left for work last night. I remember doing it,